You were born like a stifled scream between damp walls in 1549. In Japan, there was no celebration, only the clang of swords at the gates and the smell of dried blood under the tatami mats. You were not welcomed with affection, but surrounded by tension, by fear, by silences too dense to be heard without a tremor. The world in which you first breathed was already rotting from within. Every beat of your little heart sounded like a cursed drum amidst a minefield of secrets and broken promises. Your father was a daimyo. His name was a symbol of authority, but his heart was a battlefield no one dared tread. He was revered with lowered eyes and silence, but behind paper doors, servants whispered betrayal. His presence sent chills deeper than any winter. His castle stood, but its foundations trembled with the weight of centuries. Every pillar of your lineage was corroded by fear, greed, and the burden of promises never to be fulfilled. You were born into this environment, the product of a war that never rested, of alliances sustained by threats and loyalties forged in broken iron. In your crib, your mother was the only one who gave you anything other than strategies. She gave you a phrase. "Keep your heart soft, my son." She said it with teary eyes, as if she already knew that wish was impossible. As if that phrase wasn't advice, but a desperate plea, a thread of hope thrown into the abyss, as if to say, don't lose yourself, even when everything tries to destroy you. There was sadness in her voice, not just for the future, but for the certainty that she was already losing it. But the world around them didn't care about hope. The world was sharp, it was practical, and it was cruel. At 6 years old, you were ripped from your thin cotton sheets and thrown into the rot of an enemy castle. A deal sealed with your freedom, so your father could keep his title and his soldiers. You became a hostage of war, a bargaining chip, a human shield to protect fragile alliances. One mistake, and your head would be sent back inside a black wooden box, the paper sealed with blood. The ink made with your life. You cried, not because you were weak, but because you were still human. You cried for the absence of your mother's perfume, for the absence of the sound of the koto on calm afternoons, for the silence that now surrounded you, thick and viscous, like rotting fog. The walls of the fortress you now called home reeked of mold, rust, and old blood. The rice held more maggots than grains. The water tasted of oxidized metal. The ceiling, even closed, seemed to drip with contempt. The walls seemed to watch. The floor swallowed sighs. A guard passed you that first night. He looked into your eyes and said, "You'll learn quickly, or you'll die like a rat." His breath smelled of rotten teeth and spoiled intestines, and he was right. This place wasn't a school. It was a grave under construction, a grave where they taught you to dig with your own hands. You slept on a pile of straw that scratched your skin like thorns. The blanket was paper thin. The rats weren't afraid of you, and the shadows in the hallways whispered like ghosts. Sometimes I woke to the sound of footsteps. Sometimes it was just a rat. Sometimes not. My eyes stung from the smoke coming from the kitchen, where the leftovers of unknown animals were burning. Sometimes I smelled human flesh, but no one said anything. They never did. Your mother had given you a wooden horse, hand-carved, with eyes painted with paint made from crushed flowers. It was all that remained of your home. You held it as if it were made of steel. Every night you repeated her words silently. "Keep your heart soft." But the words began to lose their sound, as if the world were slowly erasing them, as if the memory itself was dying with each passing day. The guards laughed at you. One day, one of them spat on your plate. He said it was cleaner than your blood. You ate it anyway, not out of courage, but because hunger throbbed like a dagger in your stomach, as if every cell in your body begged for survival. You chewed without thinking. You swallowed like someone swallowing shards of themselves. At 8 years old, the training began. You were pulled from bed before sunrise, thrown barefoot into the freezing courtyard, the mud hard as stone and the wind cutting like steel. They gave you a wooden sword and an order, hit. And if you missed, you felt the bamboo stick crack on your back, leaving dark welts that burned like fire. You screamed, at first. Then you learned to swallow your screams. As if your screams were weaknesses escaping your body, you locked them away like enemies. And in the silence you began to transform. Other boys trained too. some smaller than you, some with emptier eyes. None were friends, none were brothers. All competed for a place in the invisible hierarchy of pain. Those who fell were trampled, those who hesitated bled, those who won survived. It was an ecosystem of brutality. Every look was a threat, every silence a warning, every misstep a sentence. One night, an older boy burst into your room. He said there was no room for sentimentality. He took your wooden horse and smashed it before your eyes. The splinters flew like shards of memory. You tried to hold back your tears, but he saw. He laughed. Only the weak keep memories. Love is a chain that drags you to death. You believed. Not because you wanted to, but because it was easier to believe than to fight against everything. It was easier to erase yourself than to try to survive with a heart still beating with feelings. In the following days, you didn't speak again. Not to the servants, not to the other boys, not to yourself. Your mother's voice still tried to appear in your dreams, but even she seemed distant. As if she too were giving up. As if she knew you were losing yourself. And maybe she was. And then something curious happened. You began to take pleasure in repetition. Each blow with the wooden sword, each fall, each wound, they all seemed to mold you into something new, as if you were being fused by suffering. Your body ached, but the pain was predictable. Unlike life, the pain became companionship, and the companionship became shield. A shield against memory, against doubt, against love. You started hitting more, falling less, getting up faster. Gradually, the guards stopped laughing. They began to watch. As if they saw there no longer a child, but a crude blade taking shape. You began to hear whispers. This one survives. As if your very existence were now worthy of note. As if the silence were giving way to something more, lethal. But a question grew ever stronger. How much of your heart would you need to kill to survive? Was it possible to survive without becoming that which destroyed others? Or did survival require precisely that? Destruction. One day you saw one of the boys being dragged by the leg unconscious. No one said anything. No one asked if he was alive. You didn't ask either, because you'd learned that questions were dangerous. And silence was survival. It was the rule. It was a shield. But it was also a grave. On the last night of that phase, you woke to the sound of heavy rain. You went out into the courtyard alone and sat on the soaked ground. You looked up at the inky black sky. You wondered, for the first time in a long time, if all this was the price of being strong. If this was what strength was, forgetting, keeping quiet, slowly killing yourself. No answer came. Only the cold water running down your face mixing with something you couldn't tell if it was tears or rain. The sound of the storm seemed to laugh. Laugh at your doubt. Laugh at your hope. But at that moment, you didn't know that all of this was just the beginning, that the world hadn't yet shown its cruelest face, that the hardest choice was still just a few steps away, and that soon, the heart you tried to protect would be called upon to decide between kindness and loyalty. The transition to adolescence wasn't marked by gentle discoveries or innocent learning experiences. For you, it was a sharp cut, a brutal silence between what was and what now needed to be. At 12, childhood already seemed like a distant and almost illusory memory, like a dream the real world insisted on erasing with iron fingers. There was no sweetness, no warmth, no idea that things could get better. There was only the brutal and predictable routine of training, punishments, constant surveillance, and survival through obedience. At that time, you began to understand a simple, cruel truth. Life didn't reward kindness. On the contrary, it punished it with violence and neglect. The boys who hesitated, who showed compassion, disappeared. Sometimes overnight, sometimes in plain sight, to set an example. One of them tried to protect a younger boy during a training session. He yelled at the teacher. He tried to stop the punishment. The next day, his room was empty. They said he'd been sent away, but no one believed it. His clothes remained. His smell was still there. You didn't ask. No one asked. Because a question could become a sentence. And silence was protection. It was around this time that a silent rivalry began to emerge between you and another boy. He was taller, faster, had ever-watchful eyes and a razor-sharp smile. He was the kind of person who enjoyed watching others suffer, not because he had to, but because the suffering of others made him feel more alive. He would break other people's nails during training, rip off small slices of skin with the tips of his wooden sword, and then laugh as if it were all a joke. And the scariest thing, the adults let him. Sometimes they even watched with a twinge of pride. You learned to keep your distance, to breathe slowly around him, to move without attracting attention, but it wasn't always possible. One day, returning from a training session, you found your wooden horse, the last symbol of your childhood, shattered on the floor. Its painted eyes were cracked. Its body was in splinters. The thing that represented your mother's voice, the thing that still held a bit of the promise that you didn't have to become the monster the world demanded, was destroyed. He appeared behind you and laughed. You don't need this anymore. This is for those who want to die young. Memories are weakness. You didn't answer, you just stared. And something inside you broke too. It wasn't just the toy. It was the thread that still connected you to a humanity that resisted, even buried. That night you didn't sleep. You spent hours sitting, staring at the pieces of the horse, as if you could put it back together with your eyes. But you already knew. What was lost there couldn't be put back together. There, in the silence, what you felt was a total absence, a kind of disembodied death. Days later, you saw that same boy fall. The master struck him with an unexpected blow. He screamed, he cried, he begged to stop. You should have felt revenge. You should have felt justice. But all you felt was nothing, indifference. And that nothingness was what frightened you most. The emptiness that begins to take the place of pain is more dangerous than the pain itself. Because pain is still a sign that something is alive. Emptiness is just absence. And the absence grew ever greater. At 14, the call came to return home. After so many years of being held hostage, you thought you could finally rest, that you would be reunited with your mother, that the scent of the plum garden would return. But there was no going back. Before that, you would have to pass a test. They said it was a test of loyalty, but the name was just an excuse for the cruelty to come. A silent ritual to test how far your soul would resist blind obedience. The group was led to a destroyed village, a place that seemed to have been taken over by demons. Burned houses, bodies hanging from lampposts, starving dogs chewing on human remains. The sky was a strange color, as if the world itself had receded from that place. And there, amidst the dirt, smoke, and despair, was a child, a girl, no more than 10 years old. Her face was dirty, her skin covered in scratches. Her eyes met his with a force that froze his breath. She held a torn doll, straw sticking out of the seams. She wept, but she didn't scream. She simply said, "Please, save me. I have no one." Those words still echo within you. Because for a moment you considered doing it. You considered breaking all orders, all rules. You considered picking up that girl and protecting her with your own body. Your hand trembled on the hilt of your sword. Your leg took a step forward. In that moment, you weren't a soldier. You weren't a daimyo's son. You were just a human being watching another in pain. But then, your father's voice. Not physically, but in your mind. A memory. Cold. Cutting. The clan comes first. Always. It was like a current pulling you back. You stopped, you stepped back, you lowered your sword. And the girl felt it. Her gaze changed. Sweetness turned to fear. Fear turned to terror. Her eyes widened. Fear turned to despair. One of the bandits approached and slowly ran his blade across her cheek. A trickle of blood ran down like a red tear. She screamed, and you stood still, immobile. Your presence stopped nothing. On the contrary, it seemed to consent to everything. The doll fell to the ground. It was trampled. The girl's screams echoed through the village and faded into the crackling flames and the laughter of those who dragged her away. Your last image was her gaze, calling out to you, begging you, and then darkness. The kind of darkness that doesn't disappear when the sun rises. The kind that settles within. That night, you didn't sleep. And when you closed your eyes, it was her face you saw. When you tried to listen to the silence, it was her voice that returned. Your mother returned too, but not tenderly. She returned as an accusation. You could have been kind. But what is kindness when everything around you is forged in brutality? What is kindness if it condemns you to death? You tried to justify it. You tried to reason with yourself, but you didn't even convince yourself. And maybe I never will, because some things don't undo themselves. Some choices don't disappear, even if time passes over them. In the days that followed, the emptiness you already knew grew. It spread, like a silent disease. You learned to stifle your remorse, to cover the hole with layers of discipline. Every training session became penance, every meal a punishment. You didn't speak, you just obeyed. And that's how you returned to your family castle. Not as the boy who left, but as a living sword. Cold, rigid, and ready to be used. Your mother's voice wasn't waiting for you. Your father didn't hug you. He just looked at you with appraising eyes, like someone examining a tool. But you didn't yet know that the real test hadn't been the one with the girl. The real test would come later, and it wouldn't come with a warning. Because when everything around you feels like a demand and imposition, what truly defines who you are is what you do when no one is looking. And that moment was yet to come. You returned home, but home was just an old, rusty, almost mythical concept. The stone gate was the same. The trees in the garden remained silent. But something had changed, and it wasn't just you. It was everything. The faces were different. The voices were drier. Even the air seemed heavier. Your father, when he saw you, didn't smile. He doesn't smile. He just nodded slightly, as if he were receiving a report, not a son. As if your presence were part of a plan, a piece returning to the board. You expected some kind of comfort, not tenderness. You no longer sought that, but perhaps some acknowledgement, a word, a minimal gesture of approval. Instead, you heard, "Now it really begins." What had come before then? Hadn't that been enough? You'd survived hell, and now you're thrown into a new one, a more sophisticated hell, with silk curtains and reverential protocols, but still a hell. The days that followed were different, but no easier. The discipline was different. The castle felt more like a maze than a home. You learned to observe before walking, to listen before speaking, to feel the weight of intentions in eyes. Every step was a test, every silence a trap. The war was no longer just outside. It lived within the walls, in the restrained gestures, in the unblinking eyes, in the formal greetings that hid knives. What's worse, being trained for violence, or being taught to smile while killing? At 15, he was sent on his first mission. A small skirmish, they said. A simple engagement to protect an outpost. But there was nothing simple about cutting into another human being's flesh for the first time. The rain fell heavily, the mud clung to your legs, and the smell of blood mingled with sweat and fear. You thought you would be ready. You thought your years of training would make you cold, but they weren't. You saw the first enemy appear, an ordinary man, dirty, tired, with fear in his eyes. You hesitated for a second, and it nearly killed you. His blade grazed your shoulder. The heat of blood running down your skin woke you. Your arm acted on instinct, and when your sword pierced his body, something inside you broke. Or was it formed? He fell with a scream that still echoes in his head. It was a strange sound. It wasn't just pain, it was surprise. It was as if to say, "Why did you kill me?" As if he too were pretending this was just another drill until it wasn't. Until the drill became real. Until the game became death. You vomited that night. Not out of regret, but because you felt emptiness, nothingness. It wasn't guilt, it was something else. An absence so profound it seemed to pull you in. You woke up sweating, and for the first time you didn't hear your mother's voice. There was no comfort, no disapproval. It was as if she'd given up on visiting you. As if even she accepted that you were a different person now. If no one is watching you, do you still have a chance to turn back? The following weeks were silent, but inside you, everything was noise. You grew accustomed to the metallic taste of blood, the sound of blades clashing, and most dangerously, the feeling of power. You didn't just survive, you won, you were praised. Your father, for the first time, said something that wasn't an order. Good job. But what good work is it when it requires the death of another man? At 17, you led a patrol. 10 men under your command. Some older, others young but seasoned. There was respect in their eyes, or maybe just fear. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they obeyed. This was new. The weight of being heard, of making decisions, of ordering a kill, of being responsible not only for your own sword but for everyone there. You saw yourself differently in the water's reflection. Your features were firmer, your eyes were darker. Your posture was that of someone undisturbed. But what about inside? Was there still something? Was there still that boy trembling in the mud with a broken wooden horse in his hands? On one of these missions, you encountered a wounded enemy, a boy, your age, unarmed, bleeding, crying, begging for mercy. He said he had a sister, that he didn't want to fight, that he just wanted to go home. And you believed him, because his eyes spoke the truth, and it angered you, because the truth reminded you of who you were. And then you slit his throat. Why does the truth hurt more than a lie? That night you didn't cry, you didn't tremble, you didn't regret, but you didn't sleep either. You sat there staring at your hands. They were clean, but you knew they weren't. And then you laughed. A short, dry laugh, as if mocking yourself, as if to say, now you are what they wanted. Your father began to trust you with other tasks, politics, strategy, negotiations. You learned to smile without feeling it, to compliment before betraying, to offer tea with one hand and poison with the other. The castle halls were shadow games, and you learned to be a shadow too, a master of invisible cuts, of double-edged sentences. But at some point, we don't know when, you stopped pretending. The coldness stopped being a mask. It became skin. It became a voice. You no longer needed to appear cruel. You were. Not for pleasure, but because operating this way was easier, safer. Kindness was a one-way street, and you were already far from it. It was too late to remember the way. Do you still remember the girl? Yes, remember, because she appears sometimes when the silence is too strong, when the smell of ash returns, when a child screams in the distance. She doesn't speak anymore. She just looks. Those eyes. That question changes. And you look away as if you could escape what she represents. But escaping memories is like trying to stop the wind with your hands. You don't regret it, not with words. But sometimes, you wake up in the middle of the night with your heart beating out of rhythm, and you wonder, what if you had acted differently? What if you had saved even one life? What if you had kept your heart soft, like your mother asked? But you can't run away from who you are. You just postpone it. Until one day the mirror finally shows you your full face. At 25, you were a sharp blade, cold and predictable. Everyone knew where you were. Everyone knew what you were. But no one knew what you thought. And that was exactly how you wanted it. War was constant. Maps changed hands like driftwood floating down a river. Your name was no longer just feared. It was repeated carefully, as if each syllable could bring death itself. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where more than 160,000 men faced off in one of the largest battles in Japanese history, you became a living statistic. But you weren't a number. You were the wind that pushed the numbers toward the abyss. You were the silence before the scream. Your squad buried those who surrendered alive. Your men hesitated when they saw friends from the past on their knees, weeping. But you didn't hesitate. Traitors die, even on their knees, especially on their knees. The battlefield looked like a purification ritual in reverse. Mud mixed with viscera, torn horses, arrows stuck in eyes. When the dust settled, you were standing over a pile of bodies, your flag planted like a sentence. Victory had cost everything, and you knew it. But you didn't show it. Your eyes were fixed. Your body was firm. Inside, however, the taste of blood no longer caused nausea. It caused silence. You left behind your last true friend. You ordered his men buried alive. They screamed your name. They begged you to remember. But you remembered something that surpassed friendship: power. And when one is forged by fear, power is the only bond that matters. How many did you kill that day? Hard to say. But army chroniclers recorded that more than 7,000 men were killed in flight. Among them were 3 generals who had once shared a table with you. One of them had been your fencing instructor. You personally beheaded him, preventing him from wielding his sword. It was there that the shogunate began to be born, not with honor, but with deceit, fire, and betrayal. It was there that Japan began to bend the knee before a name that had not yet been pronounced as a title, but soon would be. And everyone knew it. All that was missing was the ceremony. All that was missing was the emperor's acceptance. And he did, because fear bends nobility more easily than reverence. At 26, the title of Shogun arrived like a crown of thorns. The emperor handed it to you with cold hands, measured words, and a smile that hid ancient hatred. You didn't trust him, and he didn't trust you even less. It was just politics. It was just survival. Every bow was a sheathed knife. Edo Castle became your throne, but also your prison. It was grand, but it stank of sewage, sweat, and broken promises. The wide corridors whispered of conspiracies. The daimyo smiled with eyes that begged for your death. You watched them like armed children. To maintain control, you created a system. Each feudal lord would spend half the year under your direct watch, away from their lands, their troops, and their intrigues. They called it Sankin Kotai. You called it a collar. Taxes increased. Complainants disappeared. Those who betrayed were exposed. A cook was accused of poisoning. You didn't investigate. You cut him open, right there on the cold kitchen floor. His blood steamed in the heat of the stove. Your men looked away. You didn't. Fear was more effective than forgiveness. Fear was eternal. Gratitude was not. One night during a banquet, a messenger brought a sealed scroll. It was a veiled threat from a northern clan. You didn't respond. The next day, you ordered the burning of 3 villages under the clan's banner. Thousands died. Women, children, old people. And you didn't lose a night's sleep, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. The fewer roots they had, the easier they were to uproot. You rode through the ruins. The houses still smoked. Ash clung to your horse's hooves. The eyes of the few survivors, always mothers, always children, pierced you like arrows. And somewhere in your chest, something throbbed. But you squeezed your eyes shut, took a deep breath and continued. Because the price of hesitation was always higher than that of brutality. At 30, he looked back and saw no one. His friends, dead. His brothers in arms, dead. His allies, distant. His wife, silent. His son, too young to understand what it meant to be the son of a shogun. But his eyes were already beginning to see. They were already learning to be afraid. You tried to teach discipline, but fear did the job faster. The boy trembled at the sound of his name. He avoided your gaze, you saw it, and you didn't correct him. Because you believed that being feared was the only way. That affection was weakness. That respect without fear was an illusion. But at night, when the castle fell silent, you heard your own breathing, and it sounded like the sigh of someone who had lost everything, but didn't know where they left it. The boy grew, and grew fast, intelligent, observant, but also restless. He asked too many questions. He watched the maps, the generals, the meetings, and one day, an intercepted letter revealed, your son planned to seize the throne. Not now, but someday, when you were old, when you were no longer that invincible man everyone feared. You called him. You told him to close the doors. You asked for silence. You said you just wanted to talk. And then, when he entered the room, you looked into his eyes. They were yours. They were the same. And that hurt more than anything because you saw there what could have been. You saw a reflection, but not of yourself, of who you killed to become. The blade cut quickly, but the silence lasted forever. The blood on the floor formed a puddle that crept toward you, as if trying to return to you, as if trying to remind you of something. Your wife screamed. The servants wept. But you just stood there staring at the body, and something broke, not with remorse, but with emptiness, because even after everything, you still hoped he was different from you, that he had escaped. That night you heard your mother's voice for the last time. I asked you not to harden up, And for the first time you answered, "If I hadn't hardened up, Mom, I would have died." But would dying have been worse than that? Time passed, but it didn't heal. It only accumulated. Piles of bodies, irreversible decisions, restless nights. At 35, you were already more statue than man. Seen by all, touched by none. Your subjects bowed with forced devotion, and your enemies dared not speak aloud. You built a unified nation on thorns, but every step echoed like a warning. The empire was solid, but you were rotting from within. Your flesh resisted, but your soul begged for surrender. The palace gleamed, its halls decorated with gold, lacquer, and tapestries brought from all the provinces. But no amount of luxury could disguise the smell of decay that rose through the stone corridors. The air was thick. Every meeting seemed staged. Every toast, an attempt to hide fear. You saw it all, with dry eyes, with a coldness that could be mistaken for fatigue. But it wasn't. It was calculation. And at the same time, a slow decay within. The faces changed, but the looks remained the same. Submissive on the outside, hostile on the inside. Your enemies, now hidden under cloaks of reverence, were still conspiring. A group of samurai, linked to extinct clans, was organizing in silence. Their intentions were revealed by an informant you never knew existed. The evidence was on your desk. The names were there, and you read them quietly as if saying a prayer. But each name was a sentence. Each stroke of calligraphy carried with it the weight of a life that would end at dawn. The next morning, his orders were carried out with precision. The conspirators were captured and executed. Their heads were impaled on the main entrances to the provinces they had once ruled. Their eyes open, their skin pale. The crows came first, then the worms, and finally, oblivion. But the people remembered, because fear doesn't die quickly. It becomes tradition. Children grew up repeating names that no longer meant anything more than a warning. You expected gratitude. You expected, perhaps, that the daimyos would understand this was protection. But they didn't, or pretended not to understand. Their eyes grew harder, their words more careful, but their minds closed, and you knew. From that moment on, you were no longer a leader. You were an obstacle, a living reminder that blood was not currency but language. It was at that moment that something changed. You began to distrust even silence. Paranoia stopped being a symptom and became a tool. You had the guards rotate every 2 hours. You tested food 3 times before eating. You slept with your katana under your pillow and your eyes half closed. Every footstep in the hallway made you turn your head. Every shadow felt like an ambush. Every low-pitched word became a hidden sentence. One night, as you walked through the castle corridors, you heard light footsteps behind you. You stopped. You waited. The sound faded, but the silence spoke louder. When you turned, you saw a figure. The glint of the blade appeared first. It sliced through the air with precision but didn't go deep enough. The metal scraped your ribs. You fell, rolled, got up, and then you struck back. A single blow. The traitor's throat split open like an old parchment. Blood gushed silently. You didn't scream. You didn't call for help. You just stared at the body on the floor and murmured, "I knew it." And deep inside, you felt not surprise, but confirmation, as if the world had finally aligned its threat with your expectation. You didn't just kill the man. You skinned his body piece by piece and displayed it in the central square so that everyone could see what happened to anyone who tried to harm the Shogun. The traitor's servant begged for mercy. You looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, but you didn't hesitate. You cut him too, because doubt was more dangerous than malice, and because at that point, hesitation would have been more shameful than making a mistake. After that day, no one tried to kill you again, at least not directly, but the fear grew. It grew so much that it began to swallow even those who were still loyal. Your own generals barely looked at you. The court elders trembled at the mention of your name. And even your wife, who once challenged you with sharp looks and words, now avoided all contact. You became untouchable, and that felt like power. But it was isolation, a silent empire, ruled by a man who heard only the echoes of his own shadow. Over time, your body began to fail, frequent coughing, cold sweats at night, a metallic taste in your mouth that wouldn't go away. The doctors said it was age. You knew it was punishment for what you did, for what you didn't do, but you kept going. Because to back down now was to admit defeat, and you wouldn't lose to time itself. Time, after all, was the only enemy you couldn't kill, only delay. You tried to mold your heir, but the boy was weak, too sensitive, shy. You saw in him all the mistakes you tried to erase, and so you were even more cruel. The training was punishment, the lessons, humiliation. One day in public, you broke your son's arm for hesitating with his sword. You said, "Weaklings feed worms." But when you saw his eyes, something went through you. It wasn't compassion, it was reflex. There you were, small again, trembling, and for a moment you hesitated, but soon after you hardened, because showing a crack was inviting collapse. The daimyos watched in silence, but their eyes registered everything. They saw, they knew, and so did you, that there wasn't much time left, not in your body, nor in your dynasty. You were growing old, your muscles were losing strength, your hair was falling out, your skin, once firm as stone, was now wet paper, and your enemies waited. They waited like vultures on the edge of a field that no longer screams, only sighs. You began giving orders differently, fewer words, more gestures. The sound of your heavy breathing could be heard in the hallways. Your children looked at you like they would a wounded animal, with fear, and with hope that you wouldn't survive. You noticed, and pretended not to notice, because to face it would be to admit that you were already being replaced. At one of the dinners, your wife spoke, for the first time in months. She said, "You built a throne out of bones, and now you're scared of ghosts?" You didn't answer. You just closed your eyes, and inside you wished she was wrong, but she wasn't. You knew, you always knew. But only now did you have the courage to face it head on. Each morning it was harder to get up. The air in Edo felt like poison. Servants whispered. Messengers took their time, and the reports spoke of rebellions in the north. Nothing major, yet, but enough to sound the alarm. The reports stopped being paper and became omens. Each sentence felt like a sentence awaiting execution. You ordered the villages burned. Again. But this time something was different. As you rode among the charred remains of houses, you felt nothing. No coldness, no victory, just a heaviness, a sickness, a nausea that came not from your stomach, but from your soul. If you even had one left. You passed nameless corpses, bodies that seemed like small versions of yourself, from another time, another history. Amid the ashes you found a burned doll, twisted straw, charred eyes, and for an instant, you saw the girl from years ago, the one you left behind. Her voice echoed like a ghost and you whispered, "Shut up, it's over." But she didn't. She never was. She merely changed shape. Now she was smoke. She was absence. She was everything you lacked and could no longer have. That night you dreamed of your dead son, but he didn't cry. He smiled, and he said, "Now, Father, you are free." You woke with wet eyes, but you didn't know if it was sweat, tears, or illness. It was as if your body no longer had boundaries. Everything was fever, everything was memory. You looked in the mirror, but you didn't recognize yourself. The figure there seemed like a spirit trapped in its own body, a warrior without a war, a king without respect, a man who conquered everything except himself. And the question echoing deep within was simple, yet lethal. If you erased who you were, why do you still miss them? Death doesn't begin with the last breath. It begins when the soul stops fighting, when the eyes see but don't see, when the heart beats but doesn't feel. At 52, you were this, a body in motion and a soul in a coma. Your name was still feared. Your decrees were obeyed. But what is an empire without love? What is a throne without heirs who look upon it with pride, not dread? You had everything, and yet, nothing. What you built with sword and blood began to crumble in your lack of humanity. The castle you'd built with iron and fire now stank of mold, medicine, and dried blood. The once vibrant corridors were filled with a heavy silence. The paintings on the walls, which once celebrated victories, now seemed like eyes watching you. Your rooms, once a symbol of power, became a silent torture chamber. Each night was a battle against your own thoughts, a battle you never won, and each morning, a suffocating doubt. Why get up? The walls whispered, heavy with echoes of the screams you'd told them to silence. Shadows took shape, and every now and then you saw faces from the past, the child you were, the son you'd killed, the wife you'd cursed, the girl you'd allowed to be taken. Everyone stared at you without saying a word. It wasn't judgment, it was memory. And memory, that's what doesn't forgive. The doctor brought reports in terms you didn't understand. But the truth wasn't in the papers, it was in the eyes of those who served you. Your body no longer obeyed. Your hands trembled. Your knees buckled. Your breath tasted of oxidized iron. You coughed blood. The nights brought chills. But worse than that was the silence of the eyes around you. Servants who once trembled now merely waited. They waited for the succession. They waited for the downfall. You were a man dying in slow motion, and everyone knew it. And deep down, you knew it too. In your final days, you tried to retrain your heir. The boy wasn't so young anymore, but he was weak. Not in body, but in spirit. He lacked fire, he lacked hatred. He lacked the armor you'd forged with blows. And so, you broke him. You screamed. You wounded him. You shamed him. Until his eyes, too, faded. You made him king. But you killed the man. Now you saw in his gaze the same emptiness you'd spent decades nurturing within yourself. But he couldn't bear it. And you knew it. On a starless night, a storm lashed the rooftops. Lightning slashed across the sky like the swords you once wielded. And it was on that night that you fell. Literally. When you tried to get up, your body wouldn't respond. You collapsed onto the mat. The pain came. But more than pain, came fear. For the first time, you feared not death, but oblivion. You felt the weight of absolute silence, the emptiness of a life no one would mourn. Your last request was silence. You wanted to die alone, without servants, without pomp, without ceremony, just you and your ghosts. Lying there, you remembered the first time you'd held a sword, the smell of wet straw, your mother's voice saying, "Do not harden your hearts." And you realized the war hadn't begun when the clans clashed. The war began when you chose not to listen, when you decided that being strong meant killing what was soft within you. You died with your eyes open, but dull. There was no redemption. There was no relief. You died silently, at 53, in a dark room, without glory, without peace. Your empire endured for another generation. Then it fell. Because everything built on fear is one day swallowed by memory. And memory, unlike fear, does not bend. It reappears in those who live, in those who love, in those who decide to break the cycle. But this doesn't have to be your story. You, the one listening to this now, you who feel the weight of decisions, who have already experienced the poison of pride, the armor of ego, the ice of isolation, you have time. You can stop before you cross the point of no return. You can breathe. You can look in the mirror and ask, who am I becoming? Is it worth it? All mastery begins with self-control. All true power is born of awareness. It's not about killing what's human in you. It's about using it wisely. Pain shapes you, but love guides you. Silence can be a shield, but it can also be a prison. And anger can protect you, but it can also consume you. True strength doesn't shout, it understands. And when it understands, it transforms. If you want to apply what you learned from this story, start today. List your armor. What fears have made you harden? What words have you kept from saying? Which people have you pushed away for fear of appearing weak? And most importantly, what's stopping you from changing? Write it down. Name it. Face it. Create rituals of presence. Wake up early. Meditate in silence. Write down what you feel. Observe your impulses before acting. Train your body, but also your mind. Develop discipline, but without mutilating your sensitivity. A true warrior is not one who never cries. He is one who knows when to fight and when to retreat. Take a deep breath before deciding. Look beyond anger. There is life there. There is choice. Reconcile with your past. Forgive your mistakes, but don't repeat them. Use them as maps, as warnings. Strengthen bonds. Talk to those who matter, look them in the eye, listen more than you speak. And when you have to lead, do so by example, because fear obeys, but respect remains. And a respected man never dies completely. He lives on in the choices he inspired. This is the difference between being a god on paper and a real man in the memory of those who remain. A king may be feared, but only a man of integrity is remembered with love. And love is what lasts forever. If this video touched you, subscribe to the Deep Psyche channel. Like, share, and comment below on how this story resonated with you, anonymously, if you wish. Your experience could be the key someone else needs to change. Let's build a different legacy together. A legacy where harshness gives way to the courage to feel, where silence is heard, but not idolized, where power serves, not crushes, because there is still time, and because true power is not forgetting who you are.